sure you want me to be the perfect one. It's so easy to see why I push you away. With heaven inside my heart and hell in front of me, oh, I walk the endless miles to where I need to be, and it's all the same. We're holding out for change.
Hey everybody, nice to be with you again. This is Richard Sachs, host on Lost Arts Radio. This is one of our educational live streams that I hope you're enjoying. And we're going to have an actual class today that is tailor-made just for you to see. What we're trying to do is fill in gaps in all of our education that we probably missed if we had the pleasure of a public education or even some of the private ones. And some of these areas that we missed and we don't understand totally as a result are really important if you want to know what's going on in the world. One of them has to do with economics, a subject that the school system has convinced most of us is super boring, along with all the other subjects, actually. But it's not. It's important. It's really relevant to your life. You're involved in it every day. And you hear in the various political people are telling you, well, this new program's really going to fix it. It's going to make everything great. It's going to stabilize the whole economy. Everybody's going to be well off, and it's not going to crash or anything. And some of those programs work really well for a while, but there are elements that if they don't look at the root causes of how our economy works, they're always subject to some really serious manipulation and other problems. And I'm afraid that we're working with a situation like that right now, as we were looking at in some respects before the 1929 crash. And that crash, as some of you may know, was not just something that happened with no cause. It was completely created. And so what we need to do is understand more how the whole system works, and that this country, and I'm talking to you from the U.S., this country, along with almost every other country on the earth, is super rich in natural resources. And if those go into an honest economic system, then the people have a chance for a great life, and you don't have everybody on welfare having to be taken care of and controlled by government. So it's a really important subject. And I thought the best teacher we could possibly have for some background on that would be a friend of ours who's been at Lost Arts Radio before, Mr. G. Edward Griffin, and he's agreed to be here today for this and tell you specifically what we're going to do, but I want to welcome him to the show and really appreciate his time. We're getting a chance for a class taught in person by a world-class celebrity in this subject, so welcome, Ed. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that overly kind introduction. I don't know about that world-class celebrity stuff, but I have swum around in this pond of money and banking, so it's always a favorite topic for me. I have to comment on your statement just a moment ago about how so many proposals are being made, and they sound good, and even they may work, apparently work pretty well for a while. It reminded me of one of the classic books I urge everybody to read. It had a profound impact on me when I was first starting down this path, by Henry Hazlitt, and it was called Economics in One Lesson. And I thought it was an absurd idea that you could teach economics in one lesson, because I had come through the university system and had taken a couple of economics courses, just enough to totally confuse me on everything.
Right.
But
I had those courses too.
You had the same ones.
Right.
And I thought, well, how can anybody claim the absurd assumption that you could reduce all of economics into one lesson? And when I finished reading the book, I remember staring at the wall and thinking, by golly, he did it. And, so I'd like to just paraphrase that lesson here, because it'll have a lot to do, I'm sure, with what we're going to be talking about today. And Hazlitt simply said that when considering the merits and demerits of any economic proposal, one must consider the long-range impact on all people, as well as the short-term impact on some people. And there you have it. Because we get so wrapped up in thinking, oh, we got to take care of the poor or the handicapped or somebody that we favor. And we look at that one small group, and we can dream up all kinds of things that will help that one group and say, aren't we wonderful how wise we are? But what we don't recognize is that in the long term, over many, many years, and who is paying for this and what kind of suffering that creates for other classes of people that we don't consider in this formula. And it's just something that it's so simple. And I just had to throw it in there because it is one of those basic rules that they do not teach in school.
Well, actually, not only do they not teach that lesson, but they do teach you that to be something important and respectable, it has to be so complicated that practically nobody can understand it. And that shows you for sure that it's really great. And what you brought up is that the opposite is actually not just sometimes, but probably always the case, is that if you understand something in depth, you see the simplicity of it that leads to understanding all the details. So maybe what we should shoot for in this brief discussion today is what Henry Hazlitt did. And before we get into the details of that, just so people know you a little bit more as a person, before you were focused on economics, what steps brought you up to that from earlier in your life?
Oh, golly, that's a story in itself. Probably not very interesting to most people, but it's a fair question because I want to be very clear to everybody that considers my opinions and reads my works that I don't consider myself to be an expert on anything. All I try to do is follow along after people who have done seminal work, pioneering work, read their books, interview them, study them, try and pick up what they learned and taught, and then I kind of put it together, arrange it, and parrot it to some extent, if it makes sense to me. Yeah. In other words, my job is to sort of repackage it, and because unfortunately I found that many people who have great technical skills or intellectual skills in some category of life, sometimes they have trouble communicating it. Well, my specialty from the very beginning has been communications. When I started into school, as a young kid, I somehow sort of fell into a class of teaching little kids in Detroit, Michigan about radio. And this was back in the days when radio was big. I mean, that was everything. Yeah. Television hadn't been invented yet. Well, I guess it had been invented, but certainly wasn't commercialized. So I went down and took these little courses in how to speak into a microphone. And this is a microphone, and this is a script, and you hold the script here 10 inches away, and and when the director throws the finger at you, that means it's a cue. That means you start. Fundamental things like that. And I'm about 12 years old at this time. So I and a couple of other kids in Detroit really were all over that. And the first thing you know, I was doing radio acting as a kid. I did, was on shows like The Lone Ranger, for example. Right. That came out of Detroit. It was WXYZ Detroit and other programs. So I got into this as a little kid in communications. And so when I went to school, I thought, well, I'm going to be a big Hollywood producer, right? So I thought that's what I'm going to do. I went to the University of Michigan, and did I enroll in engineering or accounting or a business or something that really would produce something? No, I enrolled in speech and communications,
Wow.
So that was how I got started, and I got my degree in that. And when I came out of college, I went to work for a television station. Now, television had come along, and it was the first really big station outside of New York. It was WWJ TV in Detroit. So I worked there for a little while as an assistant director, which was a highfalutin name for a floor manager. I was one of those guys that dragged the cables around and threw the keys and threw the cues and changed the pictures that you put on the easel that the camera would take, all of that stuff. So I went I went to the military, spent a couple of years, and wound up with a very unusual opportunity to put on USO shows for traveling dignitaries. That's a long story in itself. Actually, I was trained in radar, and I was teaching radar, but I met a colonel on base one day, and he, in civilian life, had been an agent. And we knew each other from Detroit. And so he said, "Hey, Ed, how you doing?" I said, "Yes, sir. How are you, sir?" And then I went, "Hi, Dave. How's it going?" And so he got me into special services, which is what his department was. And the first thing you know, I was no longer teaching how to repair radar systems, but I was putting on USO shows. That's how I fought the war. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but that's what happened. I met Raymond Burr, and he came through on a USO show. We got to be very close friends he was there about a week, and he said, "Well, when you come to Hollywood, when you get out of the Army, come to Hollywood and I'll introduce you around. We'll get you going over there." Well, said I was all ready to go. So when I got out of the Army, I went to Hollywood, got hold of Raymond Burr, and he didn't remember me. He said, "Who are you?" "Oh, yeah, I remember. How's it going, Ed?" So, but there I was in Hollywood, had a wife and a kid, and I was going to become a great Hollywood mogul. And I discovered one of my first big red pills of life was I discovered that there were a lot of people there in Hollywood with much more talent than I had, waiting tables and washing cars. And I decided this is not really productive. So I decided to get a real job, and I went to work for a large corporation. Spent about 5 years there. I was doing pretty well, actually. I was moving up the corporate ladder pretty well. Mm-hmm. And then I started to run into some literature about the things that you and I are interested in. I've never had any interest in world affairs, economics, history, politics, none of that. But I ran into some information that jolted me, and it made me think, maybe this future world that I'm counting on retiring in is not going to be around for me or my kids. And I discovered, Richard, that I had a crusader gene. I didn't know about that, but it kicked in. It sparked. And all of a sudden, I became very preoccupied with the idea of I've got to tell other people about what I'm learning, and I've got to do something about it. So I did the unthinkable. I quit my job with the corporation. My poor wife almost had a cow. She said, "What are you doing? How are we going to support ourselves?" And so it was a good question. I had no idea what the answer was. But I decided I had to go on the road giving speeches. That was what I was trained to do, communications. And one thing led to another. I started to produce some very low-budget documentary films. And then somebody asked me to write a book. They were going to pay me money to write a book on the United Nations, which was one of my favorite speech topics. Wow. And it was only then, that I discovered that I could write. At that point, I didn't know that I could write. In fact, I was sure I couldn't. But it turned out that I was very ill at the time. And I won't go into that either, but I was really in Great Depression because I didn't think I was going to make it. They told me I had multiple sclerosis. Mm-hmm. And I looked that up, and I said, "Oh, that's not going to end well at all." But it was in that period of great depression and concern that this publisher called me and said, "You've been giving speeches on the United Nations. We'd like to publish a book on that. How would you like to write it for us, and we'll pay you good money?" And I started to say, "I don't know how to write," but I got to the I said, no problem,
We do this kind of thing all the time.
All the time, yeah. So I started to write, and it was very hard the first day. After all the research was done, I got the paper out and the pencil. And you talk about writer's block. Man, did I have it. I couldn't think of anything to write. So I just mentally took hold of my hand and said, "Write something. Put your name down. Anything. Start to write." So I started to write just anything. And, of course, I'd tear it up and throw it out. Another page, tear it up and throw it out. By the time I got to about page 3 or 4, I thought, well, that's interesting. I could use that. And by the time I got to page 7 or 8, I remember stopping and thinking, oh, my God, I can write. And this is fun. Wow. And I mention that not because it pertains to our topic today, but it's sort of bigger than that. It's one of the great lessons that I've learned to appreciate over and over again is that throughout one's life, sometimes the biggest obstacles and the greatest tragedies you face in the long term turn out to be the best things that ever happened to you. You just didn't know it at the time. As long as you're flexible, as long as you can roll with the punches and keep going. So,
some gifts are really well disguised.
They're well disguised. So anyway, I wrote the book called The Fearful Master, a second look at the United Nations, and then I wrote some other books. And finally, I wrote a book on cancer, alternative treatments for cancer, as opposed to the chem lab stuff that they try and push on us today. Mm-hmm. And then I finally wrote the Creature from Jekyll Island. And, I put a lot of dots together there, but that, in 4 or 5 minutes, is my whole life story. And everything I've written about, I had to learn from the ground up. And some people, especially in the medical field, when I was doing this thing on cancer, I had a couple of doctors, great doctors, that tell me that they envied me. And I said, what do you mean you can envy me? You guys have got all of this training. You've spent all this time in medical school. And they said, that's precisely the point. They said, we have to unlearn. You don't.
That's a big point, yeah. In fact, what you said before about that you were putting all these dots together, I find one of the intentional things that the educational system uses on us to make sure we come out unable to understand anything is that it makes you into a super specialist with no awareness of context of what you learned. So, which is great training if you want to be at ease with yourself and go into becoming a tool of the system, because you can be doing something super destructive, not know it. You're a specialist and you're doing your part really well. And you did the opposite approach. Understand the context, and then you're not going to be misusing or misunderstanding what you learn.
Oh, so important, Richard. I hear that all the time from former military people. They were specialists. They were trained to kill. Yeah. Trained to kill in the defense of freedom and democracy and the defense of their country. So it was okay, but they never questioned whether they were really doing that for that purpose or some other purpose. And when they found out later that, there's some question as to whether what we thought we were doing was really what we were doing. And it's quite true. If you're so focused on just one little narrow part of the picture, you're not going to see the picture as a whole.
Right, which is a big deal, because then you can misuse everything you learn.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if somebody with that motive is directing you, just in case that ever happened.
Yeah.
So, right. All right, so we have an introduction of our teacher for this little class of Economics in One Lesson, Part 2. And why don't we start with some kind of a relevant history, not describing the central bank right away, but how that idea ever came up, what it's for, and everybody thinks that's where all the real money and gold and everything are stored, so that they can benevolently, lend it to people and then take it back so that everybody can be prosperous. But before that was happening, you want to do some couple-minute history of how banking even started with the goldsmiths and everything, because I don't think almost anybody has any idea what a bank is.
That's a very true statement. Almost nobody has an idea what a bank is, and what I've discovered to my amusement is that bankers are foremost in that category.
Yeah, the ones who are working in the community level banks, right?
Yeah, they have no idea what their bank is doing. And the perfect example here, I have to read it to you. I've got a copy of my book here. Here's a testimonial I got from Marilyn Magruder Barnwell from Grand Junction, Colorado. And she ran it still does, I guess, but for years she ran a training company to train bankers on how to be bankers. It was sort of outsourced to an educational system. And this is her business. And she read my book and she says, quote, "As a career banker and president of a bank consulting firm, I thought I had a good understanding of the Federal Reserve, but this book changed the way I view our entire monetary system."
Wow, and she was teaching people.
Teaching it, yeah. So it's and I don't put people down for that, because, I look back in my life and I thought I was pretty hot on a lot of topics until I came across some contrarian information that had been carefully removed from my path, let's say. Right. I had to go searching for it.
I don't think it's anybody's fault if you really look at the depth of where it comes from. Even the people who have fallen for the drug of working for evil consciously, in a way, it's not their fault, because they made a decision based on what they understood, seeing through their eyes, their mind, their emotional state. I think if we were in their shoes, we'd do exactly what they did. I mean, their shoes meaning their mind and their emotions and everything. So it's almost like teaching, in the real sense of the word, is reaching deep enough into people's consciousness to show them a completely different reality that could change everything that they're doing. Even the people trying to cause harm are not irrevocably committed to that, even if they think they are. My opinion is they're all reachable if we're good enough to do that.
I agree with that. In fact, I wrote something just last night on that as a footnote to a news article that we put out. I publish a news service called Need to Know News, and we release new stories 3 times a week. And I just looked at a group of stories last night and did my own analysis and my own rewriting of the headlines and so forth. And it was an interview with a group of Antifa kids. Okay,
right.
Now we look at the Antifa groups and they're like, well, you're tempted to say they're like animals. Well,
that would be an insult to animals, but you could say that. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course we see them with their hoods on and their masks on and throwing rocks and setting things on fire and using profanities, and they're the epitome of hate and violence. And
now they're also wearing red masks with yellow designs of hammer and sickles and stars and stuff, and it's getting really blatant.
Well, yeah. So you look at them and you think that these are absolute animals, and there's nothing you could do with them. But then now we get to the point. I saw this clip of a bunch of interviews that somebody had done with these kids when they weren't in mob mode, where they were just sort of milling around, and somebody came up with a microphone and said, well, how do you feel about this, and who would you vote for, and why are you here, and so forth. And I was sitting there listening to them, and I saw in my mind's eye the kid next door that had been sent to the university. Wow. And they got him there. He was the kid next door. That's all he is. And he went to a university, and he got to be the focus of all the Marxist, Leninist teachers. Yeah. And all they were doing is just spouting slogans. And I know those slogans. I spent years ago, a part of my travels, which I didn't mention earlier, was that I became curious about this thing, communism, to the point where I went down to the communist bookstore in Los Angeles. They call it the People's Bookstore.
Right.
And I hung out there for quite a while. I think I bought all of the primary literature, and unlike most of those people working in that bookstore, I actually read it.
Right.
And exactly. They invited me to study groups, they called them, which I knew were recruiting funnels. They were trying to get me a little bit deeper involved into the party and so forth. And I played along with it. And actually, at one point, I thought, well, how do I know? Maybe I'll go for this. I haven't read this stuff. So I was really trying to be open-minded. But anyway, the point is, I've read this literature. I've read not only Marx, but I've read Lenin and Stalin and Mao Zedong. I've also read Hitler, Mussolini, and all of the collectivists. They're all the same, regardless of how they say they hate each other. And I know the slogans, and I could hear these kids repeating these slogans. And they had no idea of what they meant, nor did they understand how this was going to be used against them at some future time. And I thought, these poor kids, they're idealists, deep down, really deep. They're idealists, and they want to do what's right for the world.
And every one of these systems is guaranteed to take you into utopia, right?
Yeah.
And save the world and everything.
Yeah. And part of the strategy of these collectivist opponents, whether they be communists or Nazis or fascists or whatever they call themselves, is that they have to have somebody to hate. They have to have somebody to say, oh, those are the people that caused it all. It's the capitalists, or it's the Jews. It's the Jews, or it's the whites, or they need this passion of anger and hatred against some class of people, because that is what shuts down rational thought. Once they get that metal door slammed down, then they can program them to do anything they want.
And it's kind of nice because you're not responsible for anything. It's the oppressing class that is to blame for everything.
Yeah, it's the origin of the victim mentality, for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to your question, which is good. How can you summarize the banking system as what it really is? And of course, I think in order to do that, you've got to understand that what it is not what it was, nor what it necessarily should be. Those are kind of three different categories. But in a nutshell, banking started off just as a natural phenomenon of asking people who had the means to protect their valuable assets to protect yours also. And the people who could protect their valuable assets, in the beginning of any organized economy, were those that held first the precious metal ingots. In those days, the precious metals were iron and copper and brass, things you could use for tools of war. Swords.
How long ago was this? This is not 100 years ago you're talking.
Oh, no, we're going back a couple thousand years, yeah.
Right, okay.
Going back to the Iron Age,
Before gold was the main value store.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's always, the thing is, what is the metal good for? And, of course, the most important thing in a primitive society is to defend yourself against your enemies. Or, if you have a aggressive mindset, is how to conquer your enemies and take their stuff. So that's how it all starts. And so the ones that have the swords and the shields are the ones that are going to succeed in that kind of an environment. So the metals that go into swords and shields are precious metals. And later on, after that's all taken care of, they move up the scale, and there's a little bit of luxury involved. The first things that were exchanged as money was not even metal, it was food. I mean, that's the most basic survival component. So cows were basically among the first tradable objects of food. In fact, I understand that in Latin, the word for cow is pecunia. So there we have the origin of a pecuniary transaction is a monetary transaction. So,
well, what's the difference between that using cows as money and just bartering cows? Are you talking about the same thing, or is there a difference?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a difference between barter and money. In barter, let's call barter pre-money, because there is no money. It's just exchanging one thing for another, direct.
Right.
Money, by general definition, is an object of exchange for something. It's an intermediary of exchange. It's not the thing itself, but it's something that's an instrument of exchange.
But I always thought that had to be something lasting, and cows are not that, they're perishable. So how do they become money like that?
Well, cows are good for money for as long as they live. And as you say, that maybe there are better forms, but while they're alive, cows are good. Better forms, of course, are metals. They last forever.
Yeah.
If they don't oxidize, they last forever. Which is why gold is so useful. It doesn't oxidize. So, but you really eat gold, and so you got to have enough cows and chickens and wheat and all that stuff in exchange and in abundance before you can move up the scale another 500 or 1,000 years. Your economy is evolving and getting more complex. Now you can begin to think in terms of jewelry and precious metals, of silver and gold and things like that. Make goblets out of it and so forth. Right. So as society advances in complexity, then the instruments of a medium of exchange become more sophisticated and less immediately useful. But they all have to have something of intrinsic value. I mean, there are societies that used like seashells as a medium of exchange. And interestingly enough, those were in societies where seashells were on the beach, so they were pretty easy to come by.
But that seems like a contradiction, doesn't it?
It is. And for that reason, these never became serious medium of exchange. They were used for a medium of exchange, but just sort of like trinkets, like I'll exchange my blue stone for your green stone. Right. Because, well, we like green stones, that's all. And this is a really fine shell. I'd like to add it to my collection. But they're not as good as a medium exchange as something like a metal, for example, which never perishes. It's always useful for something, and some things are more useful for something else. The bottom line, I don't want to get too deeply into it, but it's really not complicated. I think any grade school kid can understand it, that the more use something has, the more it is a candidate to be a medium of exchange.
Right.
In a society where everybody smokes cigarettes become a very excellent money.
Yeah.
Even though they're consumable, still, cigarettes have always been chosen as money where a lot of people smoke. And they're very useful as money in prisons, I understand, and that kind of thing.
Right.
So
and they last for a while. They don't rot right away or anything if you keep them dry, right?
I don't know, I guess.
I think.
Well, anyway, the principle, though, emerges from all this, and that is that there are many things that can be used for a medium of exchange, and that's the definition of money. But some things are better than others, and there's a whole list of those qualities. They have to be fungible, which means that one unit is just as good as another unit. There aren't some that are better than others. They have to be, they last for a long time. They have to be divisible. They have to be have a useful purpose. They have to be rare. That's an important thing because you don't want it. I mean, a log is valuable for something, but you can't carry it to the market with you. So it's got to be rare.
It has to be recognizable too, right?
Yeah.
In other words, not easily counterfeited.
Not easily counterfeited, and it has to be measurable. It has to be a way to measure its value. With metals, you can weigh them. You can test their purity. Right. Now, you get into a problem with diamonds, for example. Diamonds have a lot of quality for this, but not everybody can judge the value of a diamond. They can't even tell if it's a real diamond or not.
Yeah.
So that's a weakness. And it just seems that every time you look in history as to what people have chosen for the ideal medium of exchange, meaning money, it has always, when free to choose, it has always eventually become precious metals, preferably gold and silver. That's not because some government agency or some wise group of people in a committee said that should be it. It's because that's what evolved and society chose through trial and error. I think that we should listen to that. But nobody wants to listen to it. They think, well, those were stupid, primitive people. Now we're smart. We've been to college. We've studied economics at the university. And we can invent something that we can create out of nothing. And it'll serve as money.
And it's for the good of the people, of course.
Yeah, that always gets us in.
You don't even need paper. You can just push enter on the computer and make more of it.
Yes. And maybe some point at this, we'll get over to digital currencies like, cryptocurrencies.
Cryptos, that's everybody's really interested in that subject too.
Yeah, I think they're in for a big surprise. They don't realize that is the dream of the banking fraternity, to have a cashless society, and they thoroughly intend to control cryptocurrencies. And these people are going around saying, they can't do it. Right. They just can't do it. Reminds me of a good friend of mine. I won't mention his name because he's a good guy and I don't want to embarrass him. But I remember in the beginning he was creating a monetary system, and he said, "Well, we'll work this through the internet." And I said, "Well, they can control the internet." No, it's impossible. Look, the internet. It's up in the sky. Nobody controls it. I said, "Okay, we'll see." Okay, well, anyway, I wandered too much. A banking system began, let's get to the simple part of it, is simply because if people had precious metals, a little bit of gold or silver, in excess of what they needed for their daily activities. Now we're talking about a society that's getting a little bit of affluent. It's not just primitive, it's not just hanging on day to day, but now you have some surplus. And people worry about where to put these valuable assets that represents their savings or their stored wealth, because there are always evil people in a system. They're going to steal it. They'll come and kill you for it. Yeah. And so they had the problem. Well, how do I protect this? And the initial solution was, well, you have somebody stay up all night, and every 6 or 8 hours you change the guard, and you just watch out and guard it, and be ready to fight for it if necessary. Well, that worked, but it's not an ideal solution. So eventually they decided, look, this jeweler, the goldsmith down over the hill there, he's got a vault for all of his gold, and he's got armed guards. He hires them, and they're always guarding his. So let's go over and talk to him and say, hey, maybe if we could put our little stash of gold into your vault and you guard it for us, we'll pay you a service for that, a fee for that. So that's basically how banking started, as a deposit type of banking.
So would you say that one action, that one decision, led to all the economic problems after it? Or is that an oversimplification?
Well, I don't know that it's an oversimplification, but I don't think that is the decision that led to the problem. Okay. I think what led to the problem was the next decision, Richard, which is, how do I explain this without taking too long? Okay, let's assume we'll fast forward maybe 500 years or something like that. So that now becomes the tradition and the custom for everybody to take their excess assets, gold or silver, and give it to a goldsmith to guard. And they stop calling themselves goldsmiths. Now they call themselves banks. Okay, but the same people, the same thing. Now they're banks. And, let's just say that the top banker has a son. And the old guy is getting kind of old. And the son says, "Hey, Pop, I've been looking at all this gold and silver we have here in the cave, and we're guarding it. And, it just sits there. Nobody comes and asks for it anymore. Oh, once in a while." He said, "I've been keeping track." And he says, "I think about in a year's time, maybe 7% of the people come and ask for the gold and take it out. And maybe they'll bring it back again shortly, or maybe somebody else will bring it back. But we're never down more than 7%. And this has been going on for years, Pop. Why don't we lend some of this out? I mean, nobody will know the difference. I mean, it's not going to hurt anybody. We can lend some of this gold out and charge interest on it." And Pop would say, "Well, no, that's not fair. I mean, it's not our gold to lend. We're guarding it. Right. No, we're not. We can't lend it." But yeah, Pop, no, listen to me. I'm telling you, 7% is all we have to worry about.
So it's like if somebody had you taking their car in your garage, because you had a really good garage, and they said they'd be gone for 10 years, and they said, "Well, why don't we use the car for a chauffeur business or something? Nobody will know the difference."
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. Or like somebody coming into a restaurant, checking your hat in, and then somebody renting your hat out while you're come back next week and get your hat.
Yeah, there's serious questions about the ethics involved. But
so the old boy says, no, we can't do that. That's not fair. But then he dies, and now the son is in charge of the business. So the son says, "Well, we're going to do this. This is going to be our best practice here."
Right.
So he starts to lend out 7%. And then by this time he has his son, and the son comes and says, "Hey, Dad, we're only lending out 7%. And I think we could easily go to 15%. Look, nobody ever comes to you." So this goes on. Father says, no, that's too dangerous. So that guy dies, and the second son inherits the business. Now they're loaning 15%. And then another generation, they're loaning 70%, and so forth. And so we come through this process of evolution to what they call fractional reserve banking.
Which cannot start as long as they're using gold and silver for money, right? Because nobody would.
Oh, yes.
Well, no, only if you make it into paper.
Well, yes, as long as they leave the gold in the vault.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. And as long as when you issue the receipt, it says this receipt is payable to the bearer on demand for gold. Now, if you're totally honest, you say, well, we don't have enough gold now to meet all those receipts if they came in at the same time. But they argue that, well, they don't come in at the same time. So why do we worry about that? And if they do come in at the same time, well, now we've got what they call a run on the bank.
Right.
And then the bank has to close its doors, and a lot of people lose their money and so forth. Right. So that is really, in a nutshell, how banking evolved from just protecting somebody's gold and silver into dishonest banking in terms of lending money that doesn't really exist, or it's somebody else's money with a prior commitment to it.
Well, right. And so the beginning decision that you said may have been the first bad one, to lend out 7% of the money, that was unethical too, because it wasn't theirs to lend.
Oh, yeah. If that's what you meant by the first decision, I misunderstood. I thought you meant to put the gold into the vault.
No, I meant to put the gold into the vault because the guy was going to fall for this other stuff after. But, the 7% decision to lend that out was dishonest.
Yes.
But then a whole other level of dishonesty was when they said, let's lend out more than 100%. By making receipts, because I'm assuming in the beginning, they didn't lend out receipts. They lent out physical gold.
Well,
at some point, right?
In the beginning, I believe they did, and I've never seen a lot of good statistics on that issue, but I think we have to assume that that's the case. We do know that this became a major practice after paper receipts became widely circulated.
Right.
Because that made it so much easier. Nobody wanted to carry the gold around. They wanted the receipt. As long as they were sure that their neighbor would accept it, that the receipt made a lot more sense.
Right. And then so there was this huge step after they were lending 100% of the gold out. They lent out 200% and then wherever it went from there.
Well, yeah, and of course, in order to be able to even make your books balance, even with the most clever accounting practices. If you are saying somewhere in your financial statement that these receipts are ultimately backed by gold bullion, if you say that in any way, then you've got some kind of an anchor there that, well, how much can you create, And when you go beyond 100%, the bells start to go off, which is why they have to get rid of the gold standard completely. Now nobody claims that this money is backed by anything. So
that was the next step, is that there's no gold at all.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. But, and yet somehow the bankers are such masters at this that even though there's no gold, people still make them the authority that has the license to lend out money that doesn't exist.
Well, they accept them as the authority. I think what makes them the authority is a combination of government backing and approval and licensing, so to speak.
Okay.
Like with the Federal Reserve System, they were chartered with an act of Congress, so that the governments make that. That's the big step. And then, of course, the banks themselves go to great lengths to make it appear that they're very conservative and very honest in their dealings.
Exactly.
They have guards, and they worry a lot about your integrity, and they never worry about their integrity. But are you a good person? Can we loan money to you? Are you going to repay it? And nobody asks the questions about the banks that way.
Or if the money they're going to lend you ever existed.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a business model. That's what it is.
Maybe we're skipping steps. We got to the point where they lent out money that was more than the gold. And then how did it get from there to eliminating the need for the gold at all?
Well, that was done through incremental steps. Let me say this correctly. It was always done, but not honestly or legally. The word is legally.
Right.
We've left out a big chapter of history called the Wildcat Banks, for example, which is very interesting and puts some light on this. When the second central bank of the United States was terminated, then the United States became rampant with what they call wildcat banks or wildcatters that were spreading up all across the Midwest and in the frontier West. And these were the most unscrupulous banks of all, not because what they were doing was more unscrupulous, but because it was easier to see. They would take a barrel, for example, and put it sort of in the waiting room of a bank. Now, remember, these are frontier banks, and so these are not luxurious marble buildings. These are like wooden structures, like you'd probably somebody's barn today, but it was a bank, and they put the barrel out there, and the barrel would be 9/10 filled with nails, and at the top 10% they put gold coins in there.
Okay.
So people could come in and see the barrel full of gold coins, and the guards standing around with 6-shooters, don't you dare, don't get too close to that barrel, ma'am, So they were guarding this barrel of gold, and they wanted that to prove that they were really keeping the gold. They had it there, and they didn't. That was just a facade. And it's kind of what goes on in a more sophisticated scale all around the world today. So I mention that because that is blatantly dishonest and illegal, because whatever rules and regulations existed in those days, it did not include that. But today, they do basically the same thing, but they make sure there are laws passed first that authorize it. And they make it sound like it's a good thing because it stabilizes the society and prevents inflation or runaway unemployment or something like that. So most of what is done today is pretty much the same as what the Wildcatters did, but because of legislation such as created the Federal Reserve System and a lot of state banking laws, they have institutionalized it and made it legal.
So what number of central bank in the U.S. banking history was the Federal Reserve, and what was the sequence, how it came through the ones before it?
Well, the Federal Reserve System, it came as a big surprise to me when I got into this, is actually the fourth central bank that America has had since its foundation. Mm-hmm. The fourth? I thought it was the first.
Right.
See, that's how much I learned in school. No, it's the fourth. But first we have to understand, what is a central bank? What does that mean? It's not a bank, really. At least the Federal Reserve System isn't a bank at all. The Federal Reserve System is a cartel of banks. The Federal Reserve has no banking services whatsoever. It doesn't guard any deposits. It doesn't make loans, except to other banks, interbanks.
But I mean, reserve is in the name, so it must have these vast reserves of money just in case, right?
Sure. No, it doesn't have any reserves. I guess if you looked on the books, you'd probably find a column that says reserves, and there would be some numbers there, but it'd be extremely small. Because I think, if I remember correctly, when I went through the Federal Reserve Act years ago when I was researching this, there was some requirement that all the member banks had to put up some kind of, and they called it reserves. It was like they had to put up some money. It'd be like if I want to buy $1 million house, maybe I've got to put up $500 deposit.
Right.
You know, just a little teensy bit of good faith money goes into it. Yeah. And so that's the level of reserves. I think we're safe to say there are no reserves of consequence in the Federal Reserve System. So a central bank, let's just deal for a second on that, is the word that's given to a group of banks, an association of banks, they like to call themselves, that have formed into, the right word is a cartel. It's a group of competing banks, generally competing, that agree not to compete with each other in most areas, but they look like they're still separate entities, but they fix their prices, they share patents and processes, they all agree for the same practices and so forth, so that as far as the public is concerned, they're dealing with one industry,
right,
with various components. And they do this because this allows them to operate without competition. And without competition, their profit margins can rise. And the customer has no option. He can't go anywhere else. Even though he goes from Bank of America to Chase Manhattan or to Wells Fargo, the practices and prices and interest rates and services are all the same. It really doesn't make any difference. So that's what a central bank is. It's a group of banks that have formed together, and they go into partnership with whatever government where they're located, and they form a partnership agreement, and usually the agreement agrees to give them the right to create the nation's money supply, if you can imagine the absurdity of that. Most nations say, we've got the sovereign right to issue our money, and then they give that right to the central bank.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing because, you know, you said before that even though the Federal Reserve System doesn't have any reserves, so it's not exactly an accurate name. People think, well, at least they're federal, you know, they're part of the government, and the Constitution gave the government the sole right to coin the money, and it did say it had to be gold and silver, but they gave them the sole right to coin the money. And so since this is part of the federal government, it must be okay.
Well, that's how they think of it, yeah. But it's just the opposite, actually, because the instrument of the central bank is quite distant from the government, and usually it's part of the agreement that once the central bank is given the authority to create the money and set monetary policy, then the government can't interfere in any way. The only thing the government can do is say, we'll take away this power from you, but as long as it exists, it has that unchallengeable power to issue money at whatever formula it wishes. And in the United States, it's so strange because you see the chairman of the Federal Reserve testifying before congressional committees. and it looks like he's reporting to his bosses, because they're asking him questions. And sometimes they get pretty feisty about it. And he never seems to be too concerned, if you notice. He just sits there and smiles. And basically, he's saying, yeah, well, here's the number. And if they ask for a number that he doesn't want to give them, he said, well, I'll have to look that up. I'm not sure that's something that we want to make public.
Right. And for the sake of the country's security and everything,
Yeah, that's the excuse. But it's in the contract. It's in the contract. You guys can ask all the questions you want, and we're obligated to give you answers, but you can't tell us what to do at all.
Isn't there another misunderstanding that goes right with that, is that the public thinks that it's under the control of the government because the president appoints the members of the board, but what they don't mention is that the candidates for members of the board are provided by the central bank, right, to the president.
That's so obvious, isn't it?
It should be.
It should be. It was not obvious to me, I have to admit. Yeah, I always assumed that the president, when he appoints somebody to the Secretary of the Treasury or the head of the CIA or chairman of the Federal Reserve System, that he knows these people, that they're his friends.
Right.
No, he doesn't get these names out of his personal address book. They're given to him by the donors to his campaign, the big donors.
Right.
And who are the big donors? Well, they don't get much bigger than the banks.
Yeah, good point. But even the bank itself, when you have to get a new member of the Federal Reserve Board, which I think there were 2 of them recently replaced and by the president gets to be the master of ceremonies of replacing them, but where they come from is within the cartel, right?
Exactly. Take a look at all of the chairmen of the Federal Reserve System for as long as we can remember. They all come from the banking fraternity or from academia, where they have a clear record of advocating the supremacy of the banking industry. They might as well be bankers. They're teaching what the bankers themselves want to be taught.
So for some reason, they're not nominating Ron Paul or something like that to be on one of the board members.
Not a chance. Not a chance. I don't think they're going to ask me if I'm available either.
Right,
So.
You could be the other one. See, those would have been the 2 good picks for these recent ones.
Well, that brings up a good point. Sometimes people have asked me, so what would you do if we got a president in there that asked you to be the chairman of the board, chairman of the Federal Reserve System? What would you do? And I had to stop and think about it for a minute. And I said, well, I probably would accept it. And then I'd walk in and declare that the whole place is shut down the next morning.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I had to retract because as chairman of the board, I wouldn't have that authority.
Well, what you could do as a really responsible chairman of the board that just happened to have the side effect of getting it shut down is just say, well, we're going to really be responsible and take care of the country, so we don't want any non-transparency anymore. Here's all our records of what we did for the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd probably die of lead poisoning.
some form of suicide that was highly unusual. Right?
Yeah, I think I'd become very depressed.
So what happened to the first 3 predecessors of the Federal Reserve? Why did they not last?
Well, okay, the first one was the Bank of North America, and that actually was in place when the Constitution was created and when the nation was formed. All of this history I had to learn. I didn't know any of this, but I was amazed to find out that right from the very beginning, the United States, this fledgling United States, had a central bank. Because that's the way it was done, And we had a couple of very powerful people in the United States that were pushing for that. Alexander Hamilton was one of them. And Alexander Hamilton had a lot of great qualities, but his affinity toward the banking families was not one of them. And he pushed for it. Anyway, a lot of history there. It's interesting. But the point is that we had something called the Bank of North America in place. And it sort of ran down. It was greatly esteemed in the beginning, but they did what all central banks do. They created money out of nothing. They made loans on non-reserves, and that means that the money supply expanded greatly.
So just to interject a question, about what year were they created? Do you remember?
Well, let's see. I have it here. It was chartered in 1781.
Okay, so the country existed. The U.S. existed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The bank existed, but it didn't become officially chartered until 1781.
Okay.
And it didn't last very long. Let's say I don't have the dates here, but anyway, it didn't last very long. Maybe 1783. All right.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
yeah. So it ruined the economy very quickly because first of all, understand it's a small nation and the quantity of money in circulation is not very great. So small differences in quantity can have a huge impact on the purchasing power of the dollar. So anyway, the people of the country and those in Congress decided, hey, we don't want this, and so they terminated it, and it became a private bank in Philadelphia. And then the next bank came along finally. I don't remember the year. I have to look these years up. It was 1791. Yeah, there it was. 1791. They created the second central bank, and it was called the First Bank of the United States.
Okay.
So the second central bank was called the First Bank of the United States. It just condensed this down. It went through the same history. It created money that they lent to the government and also in industry. It was not backed by enough gold or silver. The money supply inflated. There were business failures. The banks closed its doors at some points, and they did not renew the charter, so it went out of business.
So
and
how long did it last about?
Okay, and look at the dates here. I think it was 1811. There it is.
Okay.
1811.
Yeah, in junior high school, I always thought the dates were really boring, but now I can relate to what they mean. It's interesting. So
yeah.
Right, so number three.
So now we come finally to the second bank of the United States, which was the third central bank. It gets confusing there. But this is the third central bank, and it called itself the Second Bank of the United States. And we had a sort of a repeat again. That was the one where President Andrew Jackson got into the scene and really put his political career on the line by challenging that central bank. And he, if you've ever read any of that part of the history, he was a very colorful president. Yeah. And he used phrases like, the bank is a den of vipers, and I shall wipe thee out. And things like that. Yeah, he was giving campaign speeches.
So when did that one start and finish?
Well, let's see. All right, I got to fast forward here to the Bank of the United States. The dates. I should have known you were going to ask me these dates.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have told
No, I'm glad you do. I should have memorized these dates.
I want people to get really interested in history. The real history, not the junk they teach in school.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think it was right. Well, it was right after the War of 1812. I'm going to have to do a little bit deeper digging.
Okay, so
let's just say 1812 or 1813, something around in there.
Okay, got it.
And so that was the one that Andrew Jackson took on, and it was quite a struggle. And they got rid of it. They didn't renew the charter, and the president of the bank was Mr. Biddle, and he deliberately set out to ruin the economy of the country in order to blame it on him. He withdrew a lot of loans and contracted the money supply consciously and very quickly, deliberately trying to put people out of business so that the resulting chaos, he could say, there, you see what happens when you close down the venerable Bank of the United States?
In other words, to make Jackson look bad, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And people not go along with him.
Oh, yeah, and they started to go along with it because, how did they know? It's just the same today. How do we know unless we really dig into it? But actually, Jackson was censured by the Senate for this act, and it didn't look good for him. But then, through a series of almost accidental discoveries, it was discovered that Biddle himself was the one that had laid down the strategy to bring this about. And once that became public, then the game was over. Jackson was was vindicated. The censure in the Senate was rescinded. Biddle went into hiding, and
I think Jackson got reelected at that point.
Yes,
right?
he did. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that was the end of the third experiment in central banking. So we're condensing Richard, we're condensing a tremendous amount of fascinating history.
I know. Sorry.
And you learn so much from the details, but this is just the skeleton here.
So did that only last a few years, the third bank?
Well, yeah. Let's see if I have a date in front of me here from my little cheat notes. I don't have a date right here. I'd have to go back deeper. But this is. I'm just looking at the summary here. So.
Yeah, but I don't remember the years of Jackson.
I'm going to guess it lasted about 8 years or something like that.
Okay. So then there was a gap. If 8 years would have been about 1821, and there was a long gap with no central bank between then and when the Federal Reserve started, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, like 90 years or something.
Yeah, and of course we had the Civil War in that period, and it was a period in which you can argue pros and cons on this, but it was a period in which President Lincoln pretty much abandoned the restraints of the Constitution in order to fight the Civil War more effectively. And one of the things he did was to go contrary to the Constitution, which absolutely forbade the creation of money on promissory notes. That's exactly what he did when he created the greenbacks.
Well, you're saying the banks could do that, but not the government.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so, in this case, the government did that, and they called them the greenbacks. And of course, it was basically the same mechanism, but now the government was doing it instead of the banks. And it had the same inflationary effect, all the disastrous effects. But since it was in the name of fighting a war, and the element of patriotism, and then the element of being anti-slavery was thrown into it, there was not so much consideration about the Constitution so much as these more social issues.
Well, even now, some people think that the simple answer that's really being hidden by all the bad guys in government is that if they just did the greenback thing and just issued a bunch of government-backed fiat, not backed, but government-issued fiat currency, and it wasn't done by the evil central bank, then it would be fine, and everybody would have a lot of money, and it'd be great.
Yeah, it's one of the most horrible lies you can imagine, but people fall for it because they get so focused on those big bad bankers that they think they can trust those nice, kindly, honest politicians.
Right.
You know, that's the solution, isn't it? Let's have the politicians take this on. We know we can.
And
they've been trying to.
They've been trying to hide the fact that all they ever had to do was the government issue all this money, and all the money problems would be over.
Well, the government couldn't issue the money on the basis of the Constitution.
Well, yeah, but they don't follow that anyway on most of the
Okay, there you have it.
So if they just wanted to be humanitarian and know that the Constitution is outdated and, humanitarianism should be the ethic behind everything, all they have to do is issue enough money for everybody.
Well, that's what they're trying to come up with now, the poor people that are falling for this. The universal income now, they have another name for it. We just give everybody money.
Yeah.
And
why didn't they think of it sooner, right?
Yeah. And what follows after that, of course, is that, well, since we're giving everybody money, we don't really need money. We'll just give them a chip. We'll put it in their hand.
Well, yeah,
and if they're good boys and girls, we'll fire up their chip and they can get what they want. But if they're not good boys and girls and they do things that we don't like, well, they're not going to be able to eat.
Well, that should make everybody good right away, right?
It will seem that way, won't it? It's hideous. It's hideous when you see what the ramifications are behind all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you get into issues like the new idea of the social credit score.
Yeah.
Right? To see if you're a good citizen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You need a cashless society to really enforce that.
You do. Mm-hmm.
So when they had this gap of this 90-some years between about the early 1820s and 1913, this is one of the most dramatic scenes that you talk about in the Creature from Jekyll Island, which everybody, by the way, should buy and read. Amazon or wherever else you want them to buy it. But one of the big scenes that you described was this meeting. The reason for the title of the book is Jekyll Island comes into this, and there's some people that think of a way to end this long dry spell with no central bank. So you want to just give an idea of what was happening with that?
Yeah, the tail end of that period was rift with bank failures. What we had, Richard, is that although the federal government did not have a central bank, all of the states did. All of the states had enacted legislation to create state banks. And pretty much they gave the state banks the same license to steal that we had been dealing with the federal, the central banks that we had gone through to get rid of 3 times. Okay. So the states picked up that, and so there were state banks operating on pretty much the same principle. And so as a result, there were economic crises happening like little flashing lights all across the land, but they were sort of geographically limited to one state at a time. And but still, the net impact was devastating, and there was a great clamor for banking reform because banks were going belly up. There were bank runs. People were losing their total deposits. They were being wiped out. Prices, inflation was going up. Banknotes were no longer accepted great discount, and so forth.
Now, the gold standard was still in place at this time, right? It's
partially,
it's just that they were cheating on it by the fractional reserve.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's disturbing to see that when the Federal Reserve System was created, even then, I don't remember the exact percentage, but money was not totally backed by gold and silver. Even then, they had already managed to make that legal without having a central bank. So we didn't start from a solidly backed gold system at all. We started from fractional reserve banking.
So that's never really been done in this country. That's what you're saying, right?
I'm thinking. I think that's a true statement. It's never really been done in this country and in most countries. There are very few exceptions. I think that one of them that comes to mind, it was a short period of time in Scotland, and this was even before the Bank of England. I mean, this goes back historically. There are very few and very short periods of time that banking has ever been totally above board and done exactly what they said they were going to do. And interestingly enough, the banks flourished in those short periods of time. But the temptation to go beyond that and make a real killing has always been too great.
Right. Okay, so how did they arrange to start the current central bank in the U.S.?
Well, as I was saying, there were a lot of bank failures and a lot of discontent. And the banks were, especially the ones in New York, now let's face it, that was, for all practical purposes, the financial center of the country. So all serious financial transactions took place in New York. And those would be at the Rockefeller banks and the J.P. Morgan banks. And they were the lions. But as a result of that, people were concerned that Wall Street and these lions had too much power over the economy. They determined who got credit and who didn't, who got good credit and who didn't. They determined who got their loans called in and who got extensions, and it was all sort of a good old boys club. If you're on the team, you did well. If you stepped out of line, you were through. And there was a clamor for banking reform, is the phrase they like to use. It was, let's reform banking. Let's put control of all this wild nonsense. Let's get it tamed and put our good Congress and our good politicians in charge of it, and they'll solve the problem. And so they wanted banking reform. And so that's how it all started. The bill was drafted by Senator Nelson Aldrich and his committee, the National Monetary Commission, it was called. He was the chairman of it. And, of course, Aldrich himself was buddies with all of the bankers. He, how shall I say it? He was, by marriage, interlocked with the Rockefellers. All of his business associates were bankers and industrialists who were indebted to the bankers. So he was the guy that was going to bring about banking reform. And so they started on a journey, and they did a lot of propaganda to convince the American people that it was time to have a new central bank. And they didn't call it a central bank because they knew that already there was enough pushback against the central bank. That's what we had in America before. We had to get rid of it. That's what they've got in Europe. No, we don't want that. We're America. We want something unique. It's distinctly American. And so they called it the Federal Reserve System. But it was a central bank. So that's generally how it started. And there was a lot of propaganda, a lot of maneuvering. It took quite a few years. It took about 3 years, actually, before they were ready to pass it into law. And of course, the story, the drama comes when these representatives of the biggest banks in America got together and got on board Senator Aldrich's private railroad car that left out of Hoboken, New Jersey, and traveled on by rail 2 nights and a day to the south to Brunswick, Georgia. Got off and took a ferry boat across the inland straits to Jekyll Island, which was a private island owned by the wealthiest people in America at that time. That's where the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and all of their industrial friends had estates on this island. It was a resort island, a big clubhouse, beautiful building still there. You can visit it. And so they met there for a whole week in the privacy of that clubhouse, and they hammered together all the details of the next Central Bank of America, which they called the Federal Reserve System.
Wow. And then there was a thing where they came into Congress on Christmas Eve, was it? 1913, 3 years later?
Well, it was, Congress had already broken for the Christmas recess.
Right.
And there were not too many people there. Some authors have made a big deal out of that, and I can see why. I mean, why would you do that when if you were trying to hide something? And I'm sure that probably had some reason, some basis on it, because they didn't want a lot of debate going on. But the record shows, as far as I can tell, Richard, that they already had the votes in their pockets.
Okay.
Had it been done a month earlier, I'm sure that it would have passed. There just would have been debate. I think that's what they were trying to avoid.
Efficiency, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, 105 years later, we still have the same bank, central bank.
We do, yes. Mm-hmm. And the creature has arrived, and it's still there.
Yeah, and there are people that say that the way that it's set up, it's like, who was it? Meyer Rothschild said that he doesn't care who makes the laws if he can make the issue the currency. And that's what they're doing. So a lot of people are saying that the central bank basically is doing two important things. One is completely controlling the government, and the other is siphoning off most of the wealth from the actual people that live in the country to come back to the profits of the Federal Reserve System, which, if it were ever really audited in full, without all these areas they can't look at, it would show almost infinite profit on no investment. You think that's accurate?
I think it's amazingly accurate, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's ever since the Federal Reserve System was created, there was a reversal of the trend toward the creation of a middle class.
Okay.
And it's sort of shuddered to a stop. And by the time the end of World War I had come along, and certainly the end of World War II, the train was moving in the other direction to return the world social system back to the aristocracy model, where you have a elite few that really own and run everything. So
there's so many words that people just use, and I don't think the majority of the population, thanks to modern education and all the programming, know what they mean. You look at something as simple as the middle class. I bet you there's almost nobody that knows what a middle class is anymore. And they would think, if they had to really think about it, that it's the people with the middle-sized income. But the idea of a middle class, why you want to support it, is not to favor one class over another. It's to make it so as many people as possible in the country can enjoy prosperity and freedom and a good standard of living, right? And if that disappears, it's not as good.
Well, I like that analysis. I have to admit, I'm probably guilty of thinking of the middle class more in terms of economies and financial abilities than in terms of other elements, which I catch your point, probably far more important. I mean, the level of education, personal independence, freedom to be who you want to be is more important than just having a lot of money in the bank. But now that I'm thinking about it, I have subconsciously thought of the middle class as a way of never challenging the upper class, because I figure if the upper class, in terms of money, has made their money fairly and not through plunder, legalized plunder, which we were talking about. But if it was because they had done something great for mankind and people wanted to buy their goods and services, more power to them, Yeah. I've always thought about the middle class of being a way to encroach on and eventually eliminate the lower class, so that there was no longer any lower class.
Nobody's just trying to avoid starvation every day.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. And another advantage of eliminating that class, you're not killing the people, you're moving them into the middle class. And so you don't need this vast amount of money to help them survive, because they're already surviving. Mm-hmm. Right. And also, I've noticed that when the economy is going really well, and there is freedom, which is becoming more and more just a theoretical academic point, because we're not seeing it happen in real life. But when it really happens like that, one of the industries that starts doing really well is true private charity. And they take up the slack, and the government's really not needed for that anymore.
Very good point, Richard. I become aware of that periodically when I come across some old doctors. They're still around. Yeah. They'll tell you that back in the day that when government didn't provide for anybody's health care, everybody had it.
Yeah, it was really different.
Everybody had it, because if you couldn't afford it, the doctor would take care of you anyway.
Dr. Paul talks about that, right?
Yeah.
30% of his time free.
Yeah.
Something like that.
But now that we got it all institutionalized and allocated to somebody's tax bill, and we got exemptions and ways for some people to escape it, well, nobody cares. That's all being taken care of by the government. So now we got people deathly ill.
It's the same thing with now that we have free education, you can graduate with a $500,000 debt.
Yeah. That's a good free education, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody thinks that the central bank is keeping the country, who even have any idea what it is, which probably not too many, but those people think maybe that it's keeping stability in the American economy, just like the way that they got it instated in the beginning. But if that's not true, what would it be like if the central bank wasn't there? Would we go back to criminal state banks taking over? Does it make it any better, or what's the difference?
It's a hypothetical question, because we've never tried it. We don't really know.
Right.
But I see that all of the elements are in place for us not to go backwards to the criminal state banks, which are merely smaller versions of the criminal federal bank.
Individual central banks in each state, right?
Yeah, it's just a decentralized version of the same scam. Right. So we don't want to, I don't see going back to that as any improvement at all. But what I'd like to see is to go forward to a point on the spectrum where we have never been before. And that is where banks, like all other institutions, would be required to keep their contracts and wouldn't be given any special privileges over anybody else. They'd have to be honest and be productive and can't rely on the tax doles to bail them out any more than somebody running a shoe store, you see?
Well, but if you can't do fractional reserve banking in this legalized criminal money business, what's the point of being a bank, right? Who would want to do it?
Who would want to do it? they might want to have to do something else.
I mean, is a real bank, is that a storage facility? Do you have to go back to the goldsmiths before they discovered that they could cheat and say if you got a bunch of honest goldsmiths to do it right, that would be what a bank should be?
Well, we do have some very short examples of what honest banking is. And in those cases, they did perform basically as a clearinghouse for the different currencies. And in those days, different currencies meant different coins. So they needed somebody to say, well, this coin is good and that coin is not so good. They needed somebody to test the coins and sort of declare that this is worth that number, to put a value on the coins. They needed somebody to store and guard their little collection of coins. They needed somebody to introduce them to those who might be willing to make a loan to them to provide financial services. And so for all of these things, which are valid services that a bank can provide, the bank charged a service for it.
Okay, so there's a little percentage that you pay, like a negative interest rate, right, for having the money in the bank.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, you could say that. Except instead of calling it a negative interest rate, which is kind of a back way of confusing the issue, just say it's a fee, storage fee.
It's a fee, right,
yeah,
right.
Storage fee.
So if you go to a mini storage and you've got stuff from your house that you need to put somewhere safe, you pay them so much a month to do that.
Yeah.
And if you were bringing stuff in and out of storage, there might be some transfer service fee for that, and that would be a bank. It
would be a bank. And then a very innovative bank, in my view, would be one that said, okay, now that we got all this furniture stored here, let's ask everybody if they would come in and mark those things which are potentially for sale. And we'll store them over here, and we'll see if we can sell it for them, you see.
Right.
An innovative an auction service. And then you could add different services on top of that, but it would be transparent and totally useful.
Would the lending function disappear?
I don't think so.
You just have to have consent of the people who are storing stuff to let them lend it out.
Exactly. Right. Well, they have that today to a certain extent. If you notice if you go to your savings account and your banking account, there might be a difference in wording. In some of your receipt books, it'll say this is a demand deposit. In other cases, it might say this is a time deposit. And
right.
They mean a lot. That's a lot of difference in meaning. The demand deposit means you can come in and demand it at any time. That means, brother, we're not going to lend it out or put in any encumbrances on it. It's in the vault. Now, you might have to pay a service for that. But the time deposit is one that, if you want your money back, we need some time to give it to you because we've loaned it out to somebody. And it's going to take us some time to get it back. That's a fair, honest statement of an arrangement. And for that, they will pay you money to store your money there.
Okay, yeah. If you let them lend it out, then it would be an above-board arrangement with mutual consent and everything, totally different.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize their money might not be there. But that's getting grayed out anyway because the bank is allowed to just issue money that they don't have, and they could do the same thing to pay you back. You have a piece of fiat currency. They could just say, just a minute, let me print another one and give you your money back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a slow transition, an evolution going on. And I wasn't aware of it until fairly recently. I realized that it used to be that the banks would make money off of interest on loans of money that was put on deposit with them.
Right.
And then they expanded that so that they could build on top of the amount of money that was put on deposit with them. They could create more on top of that, and that would increase their interest profit level considerably. And then at some point, they don't even care about the money that's in there in the first place. It's all created out of nothing.
Yeah, it's just fake money anyway.
It's all fake. And so the only reason they have an interest in your money being in the bank is so it can move through your account, through your credit cards, and they can collect service fees.
Right.
And also use it as a means of loaning it to you at interest. So it's no longer just interest on money on deposit. It's for velocity and charges.
Well, so now that we do have this central bank that's called a Federal Reserve System, just to confuse people, what's the relation between that authority and the local banks?
Well, the local banks, most of them are merely part of a larger banking system that itself is a member bank of the Federal Reserve. They're part of the Federal Reserve. See, the Federal Reserve is nothing more than a cartel.
Right.
It doesn't really exist as an entity. It's an association of banks. That's all it is. It has a contract, has a charter, but it's just like the AMA is an association of doctors. It's not a medical establishment. It's an association of doctors.
Are the owners of it partly outside of the U.S. or are they all in the U.S.?
This is sometimes very hard to resolve because the records are not readily available, and there's some suspicion that there's a Class A and a Class B level of ownership. My answer is yes. There are lots of them outside of the U.S. Now, if you were
there has to be a reason that the Federal Reserve wanted to make zero interest loans to all kinds of foreign banks when they recently got this. What did they call that deal when they gave a whole bunch of money to the Federal Reserve? Congress.
Oh, you mean the bailout?
Yeah. A lot of that money went secretly overseas, and they in turn bailed out all these foreign banks. And if the owners were all inside, why would they do that?
Well, I don't know, because we don't know how they did it. But there's the most obvious way to do that. You don't have to be a genius to figure this out. When, let's say, J.P. Morgan, let's go back to the origins of the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan was probably the most influential banker at the time in the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And he had access to huge resources and had huge amounts of money that he was plugging into the holes, and he would get it back plus some kind of a benefit. What most people don't know is that Morgan was an agent of the Rothschilds. Morgan wouldn't even have been in business. He wouldn't have been selling apples on the street corner if it hadn't been for the Rothschilds bailing him out when all the other lending institutions and underwriters were going belly up. The Bank of England gave him a very generous amount of money to buy up the pieces of the wreckage. And everybody said, oh, J.P. Morgan. They didn't know that it was really Rothschild. So now, who bought this? Who put the money into the Federal Reserve System? J.P. Morgan did, of course, a lot of it. But was it his money or was it Rothschild's money? This is where it gets a little difficult. And this is why a lot of corporations use street names. I mean, investors use street names and create institutions that are intermediary so that you can't trace to the original ownership.
Right. Well, okay. So if that's the case, then how could you characterize the relationship between the central bank in the U.S. that we call the Federal Reserve and the ones almost in every other country that are doing something similar, and they're all coordinated under another level, right? Which is maybe BIS in Switzerland, or
it is exactly.
If you step back, what's the bigger structure?
When you step back, you see very clearly the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, and the United States is the biggest dog in the herd or the pack, but it's not the only dog. All of the central banks of the world are sort of a conglomerate, and they work in unison. It's true, the Fed is the dominant one, but it's not the master of the thing. So, yes, you have to realize this is an international consortium that we're dealing with. And all of these people, including the chairman of the Federal Reserve, think of themselves first not as citizens of their own countries, but as citizens of the world and as part of the international community.
So whenever there's a movement in an individual country to get rid of basically fractional reserve banking and put in a true gold-backed system, which we saw recently in North Africa, in Libya, right? They were going to do that for all of Africa, which means they had to be invaded and bombed right away. And during the invasion, before they were even finished with the war, one of the first things they did is set up a BIS-oriented central bank, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it'd be surprising if it were any other way, really.
Yeah, because that could have changed everything if the ruler of Libya could have followed that plan through, because he had done a lot of things to build up his own country, and he thought for all of Africa, we'll just put in a total gold system. That must have been a big threat.
Yeah. It's not. It will not be permitted.
Right. Exactly. So at this point, what are the possibilities? Well, I mean, I'm trying not to end on a negative note at all, because I'm interested in solutions. And so there are two levels of that. One is you look at the possibilities of Congress, who theoretically has a possibility to abolish the central bank. They just don't do it because they're all owned by blackmail and bribes, basically, if you want to get, not too technical. But the other, so the likelihood of them going against their own controllers doesn't look really likely. But on a local level, if it were done everywhere, there's another option, which I think has become a project of yours, right? So I'm wondering if that means you reached kind of the same conclusion, it has to be done in another way, and you came up with something called Freedom Force.
Well, thank you for that lead-in, because that is exactly, in my view, the answer to your question of, how do we close this conversation in a positive way?
Yeah, we can't all go just jump off cliffs right now. That's really not the point of the lesson,
Yeah, go sit in a cardboard box, face the back of it, and eat worms.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't help things that much.
No, we can. We must solve this problem. We must reverse that trend, and we can. But I think, as you so correctly pointed out, it's got to be done in a different way. We can't just say, well, who are we going to elect to be president? Let's just find one man. No, one man is not going to do it. Which party are you going to vote, Republican or Democrat? Come on, guys, give me a break. Both parties are committed to this trend. Right. So we have to look deeper. How do we really bring about a transformational change in the system from ground up? And that is both discouraging and encouraging, because it's discouraging because it's a huge task. We'd like to think of some little thing we can do. Yeah. But it's encouraging because all of a sudden, when you think about it, it becomes quite doable. You can see how to do it, at least. It's just a question of, that's the path. All we have to do is just have enough force to travel that path. We can see how it should be done. And that is, we have to replace these people in the system that already are entrenched. We're not going to get them to change their minds. I don't care how many letters we write to them, how many petitions we send to them, how many phone calls we make to them. They don't care. They don't listen to the people that write them letters. They listen to the people who write them checks. Yeah, the big ones.
They hire a staff to make sure they're not bothered by constituents.
Yeah, and then they hire another staff to find out what the constituents want to hear them say.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And then they say, okay, write me a speech.
Yeah, that's a big profession as speechwriter, right?
Exactly.
If you know how to do that to get all the votes, you can do really well at it.
Yeah, and that's how they all do it. They all do that.
Shouldn't it be a felony to give a speech written by somebody else?
Oh, I don't know. I had to think about that one.
Okay, well, we'll do that later. But
what if somebody else wrote it and you agreed with it? I'd love to give George Washington's farewell address.
I think the thing is, if it's really you, then it's fine. But the only thing that people learn from that is what your speechwriter believes.
Exactly, and he doesn't believe it either.
No, exactly.
That's the point.
Just a PR expert.
He's reading the polls. See.
Okay, so you thought up this idea of Freedom Force. What's the idea of it?
Well, the idea of Freedom Force is to build from the ground up, to bring together a small cadre of people who really know what's going on. The people, and I'm sure they're listening to your program here. You may have some newcomers, you may have some old timers, but I think in general your audience, and audiences of many programs like this, they're huge when you put them all together. People know what is going on. We are not alone in this anymore. They'd like us to think we are. So my idea was to bring that group together in unison and unite them under something which we'll talk about in a moment. It's not so easy to, what will unite people? And so the idea of Freedom Force International was to put that movement together. I decided that we needed to know what we believed in as well as what we're against. We had to know what we're for, because history is loaded with cases where nations and whole parts of the globe have ridden up against some tyrant, only to overthrow him with another one and replace him with another one that's just as bad or worse, because they get so focused on what they hate that they forget that the people, maybe even some of those who are fighting on their side, just waiting to get in and not change anything, just to take over the palace.
Right, exactly.
Just to move into the palace, that's all.
Yeah. In other words, how do you systematize ethics?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question. And the answer, I think, is you have to state what your ethics are, and they really have to be specific. It's not just generalities like, let's do what is right, or let's follow the Constitution, or, these vague statements. They're okay, but our enemies use those phrases all the time. They don't mean them. Well, they have a different meaning in their mind than what we do. Right. So the first thing I had to do is to come up with a creed. What is it we believe in? How do we expect people to unite? What is the thing that unites us? Yeah. So I came up with the creed of freedom. And it's, I thought I was going to have a lot of trouble in the beginning because this is pretty specific. These are not generalities. These have to do with, where's the origin of your rights, man? Is the state given to you, or are you born with them? Some people might say, did God give them to you? But nobody would argue that you're born with them. They're yours. They're intrinsically yours. They didn't come from the state. And things like that.
The whole idea of America, which could be copied anywhere in the world, is that your rights are not privileges from government, because then they could be revoked.
And it says so right there in the preamble. I mean, in the Declaration of Independence, the purpose of government is to protect these rights. These inalienable rights is the word they used, or unalienable.
I never got clear on that one. But that's the whole point.
Yeah. And so the whole thing was to get clear on the principles of liberty, and I was surprised to find out we did that. It published that in 2012. I expected a lot of libertarian types and a lot of philosophers and authors and academics would say, well, I don't think that phrase is right, and there's an exception here, and so forth. I thought I was going to be chopped to mince meat. But I have had virtually no serious objection to the statement of the Creed of Freedom. The only ones that object to it are the ones that believe in the other creed, which is the creed of collectivism. That's the one that dominates the world today.
Yeah, will control you for your own good, in other words.
For your own good, yeah. You must be enslaved for your own good.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
I want to ask you one thing before you move on from there. Freedom. I think everybody believes in freedom. What happens when you get people in a country like in America where they will start, you're a health person, so you get toxic agriculture, for example. They want the freedom to poison the whole world under the guise of feeding it, but they're in a country run on the basis of freedom. So how much do you have to put caveats in there, and who decides what they are, what you should not be free to do?
You're absolutely right. We have to have a caveat. There has to be an exception to freedom. And who determines what that is? The answer is we do. Okay. And we put it into our creed of freedom, and we ask people to study it, think about it, and then decide, do you agree with it or don't you? Okay. And that's one of the things that we've had very little trouble people agreeing with. It's surprisingly enough. And here is that rule. Condensed down to the simplest statement, it is that men should be free to do anything they want to do and use coercion to do it only in 3 areas. And that is the defense of life, liberty, and property. Nothing more. That's where we close the door. That's because we all have an inborn, inalienable right to use force, if necessary, to defend our lives, to defend our freedom, and to defend our property. So that is what we can delegate to a state to use force for, and nothing more.
All right, so if you take that principle and put it in a real-life situation, let's say that there's a really profitable business dumping some unimaginably powerful poison into the public water supply to make money. How would the principle that you just illustrated
Very simple. The question is that endangering life? Is that endangering my life and your life? Anybody's life? It certainly is. Yeah. We have a right to prevent that from happening. And it doesn't mean just because it's for profit. They could be doing it because they're stupid and don't know any better. It doesn't make any difference why.
Yeah, they could think it's a public service.
They could.
Yeah.
So the profit is not the element. It's the question. They are doing something that's endangering life. Therefore, that's the proper sphere of the state.
Okay, so there's no freedom to do things that will endanger life like that.
That's
at least, right? Okay. All right.
Life,
so
liberty, or property. Those are the
life,
three
liberty, or property. If it's endangering those are protected.
Yes.
And government is for that. So I'm just getting to the last point here. What Freedom Force currently, after several years of development, is offering people is it helps people who believe in that creed of freedom to get into positions of authority. Is that true?
Well, that is true. That's the other element of it, and that is to convert this creed into reality.
Right.
Just because we say we believe this and then don't do anything to make it happen, we failed. We might just as well forget it.
Not good for anything.
It's not good for anything. So we come to this question of what do you do with these collectivists who are already entrenched in all the positions in the media and in government and the school systems, the judicial system. You have to get them out of there. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you go in there with guns and bayonets. Right. This is, that's not. They didn't go in with guns and bayonets. They went in because they became dominant in the society and convinced people from the school level up that was what they wanted. We have to do the same thing. We have to be dominant in society with our ideas.
Okay, so how much of that structure and system that's working have you got running at this point?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it's all pretty clear in my mind and in the minds of our top people, but only a little bit of it is actually built. The foundation is pretty well built. I think the couple of first tiers of stone are in good place. Now we're getting ready to put a doorway in and a window and so forth. We're building it as we speak, and I would invite anybody who's interested in this to come to we have several sites. The main one is freedomforceinternational.org.
Okay.
And be prepared to see that changing because everything is in flux right now. And what we didn't mention, Richard, is that part of the concept of Freedom Force is that there will always be a small group of what we might call the watchers, the guardians, that were willing, like I am, and I'm sure you are, I'm willing to dedicate my life to this thing. This is so big. That's the crusader gene that went off in me. I can't help it.
It's pretty incurable.
It's incurable, yeah. So I'm willing to dedicate, as not my total life, I have my family to take care of too and other obligations, but everything else to it. So there are people like that, and these are the ones that will be attracted to Freedom Force. No, we can't do this alone, so we need lots of help. And around this inner circle, we recognize that there's a huge group of people whose motivations and hearts are in the right place. Their principles are good. They know there's something wrong. They may not want to become scholars. They may not want to spend half their lives reading about this and going to seminars and all that stuff. But they know that something is wrong and they want to make it a better world. And we ask for their help. And we design projects that are uniquely suitable to this level of understanding. And we call this the Red Pill Project. And it's based on that sci-fi movie of about 20 years ago, The Matrix.
Right, exactly.
In which, you take the red pill and you can break out of your illusion and see life the way it really is. It might be uncomfortable. You might want to take the blue pill and go back to sleep. I took a look at that a couple of years ago and I thought, that's a pretty good allegory for what's really going on. So let's see if we can popularize this whole thing a little bit without losing its content and without losing its integrity, but just make it something more interesting than study the Constitution,
Right.
And so we put on our first Red Pill Expo a year ago in Bozeman, Montana, of all places. We thought, a couple hundred people might show up. We were blown away. 600 people showed up from 12 different countries, and they were attracted by the idea of the red pill. And, of course, they knew that we had some very serious stuff. This wasn't just a pop sci thing. They knew we were serious all the way. And it was so successful that everybody said, we want more, but we don't want to wait another year. Let's do something now. So then the next idea came up, well, let's do the Red Pill University, which is the same thing, but it's all year long, 7 days a week, all 52 weeks out of the year. So the Red Pill University is now under construction as we speak. So that's another place to go. And in fact, that's now our main portal, is Red Pill University.
What's the URL connected to it?
redpilluniversity.org.
.org. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's like a real educational institution, basically, right?
It is very real. It's probably more real than most of the universities that we now spend so much money to support.
Right.
It's real in the sense that we have faculty who come from out there. I mean, now that we're talking about it, I think that you should be a faculty member at Red Pill University.
I'm really interested in that, yeah.
I'd like to give you a classroom. You're exactly the kind of a person that should have a classroom at Red Pill University.
This is all online, right? So you have people from all over the world teaching, and they don't have to all move to Red Pill City or something.
Exactly right. Oh, that'd be horrible, wouldn't it? Red Pill City.
That'd be like the free speech zone that they've always wanted to create.
Yeah. Man, that would be interesting to say the least. So anyway, we have faculty. Well, just to give you an idea, Robert Kiyosaki has been one of our favorite presenters. Wrote the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and he talks about the red pill of investments. And everybody's got a red pill to talk about. It might even be something that most people consider to be wacky. I mean, we haven't had any UFO presenters yet, but I imagine somebody's going to come along and say, "Hey, don't you know those UFOs are real?"
Well, you know what real science is that you're open to and question everything.
Exactly.
You don't just write off certain subjects because they're defined as too strange or something. You can't do that.
If you did that, you would never learn anything, because
That's right.
I look back in my history, everything that I now hold dear, I thought was wacko the first time I was introduced to it.
Yeah.
So if I judged it on the basis of my first impressions, I'd still be back there.
The big breakthrough discoveries were not made by people approved of by the system.
Yes, so true.
So Red Pill University, is it functioning now, or is it just getting ready, or what?
It's both. It's functioning. We're asking people to be generous, to come in and help us build. You think they can come in and enroll right now. And we do have some features up. This is a little premature, because I think in about 2 weeks is what it's going to take us to get our Red Pill University website completely changed in its appearance and functionality. But it's there now, and we decided, wish we had some big donor that would give us a lot of money. We could move forward, but we're not waiting for that. We're just going ahead.
As long as there was no strings attached too, right?
Oh, of course. No strings attached at all. So we're not waiting for that. We're just going ahead, and we're bootstrapping. So that's what you'll find there.
That's great. And
then finally, Richard, the final part is that this still isn't enough. You can't change the world sending emails and looking at videos.
Okay.
The next step is to build campuses of Red Pill University in every county in the United States and in similar geographical locations around the world.
Okay, so what does that mean, a campus? Because you're all online. So what are you talking about?
I'm talking about a group of people in local communities that get together eyeball to eyeball and decide, okay, how can we make a difference in our community? How can we help get good people elected to the county council, the city council? What about the school board? This is where it spills over and begins to make an impact in the political world. This is where we begin to make a change in those nameplates on the desks in Washington and in the state capitals. It starts with the campuses.
It seems like this would really mesh in well with the work of somebody like Tom DeWeese, because he's talking about restoring property rights and freedom and getting rid of Agenda 21 and all these different names that it's proceeding under, things like that. It seems like so many of these movements would go well together.
Exactly. And Tom DeWeese, by the way, was one of our presenters at the last expo in Spokane. Yeah. And he is exactly the person we're talking. He'll be one of our faculty members.
Okay, perfect.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
we'll probably start off when we finally go live with all of these videos. Probably start off with maybe a dozen.
Okay.
But I'm looking ahead to a year or 2 years from now. We may have 100.
Okay, so 100 classes or a whole bunch of. How many teachers do you see having?
Well, I'm seeing teachers in classrooms as the same thing.
So you could have like more than 100 teachers in a couple of years.
I'd like to think so.
Okay. Sounds really great. Okay, so what we're leaving people with is actually super positive right now, because it's an understanding of at least one class of issues that has to be resolved, but it's giving avenues to do that. You don't just protest or beg Congress to please not be affected by bribes and blackmail, or be really not, don't pay any attention to that stuff. And you're not saying to the Federal Reserve, please abolish yourself or anything like that. You're putting different people, hopefully people of good ethical and character foundation, and you're defining that. You're not just leaving it, amorphous. You're saying it's based on freedom and these few areas that you can't have freedom in, to just go and make money by hurting everybody, or even if you're not making money. Other than that, make as much of everything and profit and stuff as you want by doing something useful that's going to serve everybody.
Yeah, it's that state of seemingly chaos in which this milieu in which the best ideas rise to the top.
Yeah.
And the imperfect ideas just sink to the bottom and disappear. This is how society advances.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. So everybody should go to redpilluniversity.org and freedomforceinternational.org, which we'll also be developing. And maybe what we could do at a point that you decide is worthwhile is come back and let us know the next stage that these things get to and what people should do at that point. Okay.
Well, I'd be glad to do that. If they want to come on and come into Red Pill University as a student, we have all different levels. Got to collect a little money to make this thing work. The lowest level is $3. $3.
Okay. Okay.
The cost
great.
of a cup of coffee.
Well,
and it goes up from there.
I want to see vast amounts of money starting to get connected to great projects.
Well, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, a lot of our best teachers are getting squeezed off of the internet. They're getting defunded. They don't have advertising. They're getting pulled completely. I want a place for them to go. And at approximately half, maybe a full half of all the tuition that we collect is going to be redirected to our faculty members, in order so we can sustain people that, they don't have any other way to sustain themselves.
And that is a form of censorship. Just make it impossible to survive if you're saying unacceptable stuff.
Right.
So if you're going to be paying your teachers, it's super exciting, because we've been trained intentionally to think that money is really bad. Having anything that you want is bad. Having your own desires and working for them is bad. And these are ancient religious teachings that are now subconscious almost everywhere. And people don't even realize it. So that's one reason I'd like to see that reversed, and put plenty of money in projects, both in paying your teachers, but also in, expanding in ways that you need funds for.
Yes, and those will be primarily led by the teachers themselves, because they'll be in the best position to determine what projects to institute. If we try and pull that all into ourselves so that we can control it, we'll kill it.
Yeah, you're another central tyranny, basically.
Yeah, we'll just throttle it down to death.
Yeah.
So our plan is to monitor all of our classrooms in terms of the number of minutes that these are being watched.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of each month, we see this classroom got 12% of the total watch for that month.
Right.
So whatever funding there is in the honoraria fund, that's
12% of the pool goes to them.
That's right. So the decision is made by the students.
Right, and it's an incentive for a teacher not to just stand up there and be boring.
Very big incentive, yeah.
Which is great. Well, the common system doesn't account for that at all.
No, it doesn't like that at all.
Okay. Well,
not like entertaining teachers.
We've probably kept you too long. I hope you don't mind. And
Richard, I could talk about this for days. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
I hope you'll be back soon, and we'll stay in touch.
I'll be here.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.
See ya. Okay, you guys, that was G. Edward Griffin, author of Creature from Jekyll Island, which I think is really important reading for anybody that wants to understand the banking system and a little bit more about the economy, not just in America, but all over the world. You saw by what happened in Libya that it's very important for the real power structure that's in force right now to in control, to put central banks in charge of every government and every economy so that it can siphon off the money and the political power and everything, no matter what the system is called. So that education, like so many other aspects of real education now, shows you that there's a very serious situation happening on this planet and the life of not just humans, but if you understand the bigger picture, all of the biosphere is hanging by a thread. And it would be a really good time for us to wake up to the next level and actually do something constructive instead of falling for the suggestion of the power structure and the corrupt media and everything to fight each other and focus on what's wrong with the other guy and who you should kill and who's bad and everything. That is good to understand, but then action should not just be in fighting and destruction. It should be in creating something so positive that it's just going to overwhelm any negative aspects of what's going on now. And I think that's what people like G. Edward Griffin are doing. And I really like to highlight inspiring people like that. I think it's a great privilege. And I feel really fortunate to be in the front row of getting to talk to these great people that I would otherwise never communicate with. So it's because of the interest that you have that we're able to do that, and I really appreciate it. So remember, besides the live streams, occasionally whenever we get to do those, more and more now, we're doing them sometimes multiple times a week. We also have the Sunday show that is where we started with the educational guests on every Sunday night, 6 o'clock Pacific, 9 o'clock Eastern U.S. time. And if you're in another country or somewhere that doesn't fit your schedule, it's okay because all the archives are there and going back to the beginning of Lost Arts Radio years back. And they're all free, so you can look at that anytime. A lot of great material there. We also have a new show on Saturday afternoon, 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern, which is analyzing a few of the critical developments in the world in the news from the previous week and what they mean, what their implication is for our lives, how to understand them, and what solutions they're suggesting if you really understand what's going on. That's called Lost Arts Radio Live, and you're invited to that if you can, or just watch the archive if you can't come to the live stream. And those are all free, and they're great shows. And then anybody that wants to carry it further and start working on themselves, because I think that's where the ultimate solution really is not condemning all these bad things and bad people and stuff like that. That may be true, but it doesn't get us anywhere. The real solution, that's the biggest taboo, the biggest secret that I've found in 53 years of research and experimental stuff that I've been involved in health and in consciousness and other things, is the biggest secret I can tell you is the bottom line is who you actually are. And you're supposed to have the idea of being helpless and limited and temporary being, a pile of dust, a worthless person who can't do anything right, and whatever you want is wrong. And, this kind of programming that's been ancient religious and government programming for many thousands of years. It's because the secret is the opposite. The truth is the opposite. And if you're ready to actually get into the actual work in your own life and in yourself, not anything anybody would necessarily see you doing, but it's a complete change in perspective that opens up the possibilities of what you can really do based on who you really are. You might want to check out our Saturday meeting that's private, in a private format. It's interactive. It's really interesting if you're ready to get into this stuff. If you're not, then it's probably not worth, taking the time for. But if you are interested, it's there now. It's finishing the beta stage, and that's at lostartsradio.com /club. And if you're up to that, I'll meet you there on Saturday. In the meantime, have a great rest of the week. Another great live stream is planned for tomorrow. And then this Saturday, we'll have the club meeting and the other shows. And thanks for participating. I really appreciate you very much. It's what allows us to do this. And we'll see you next time.
Introducing Lost Arts Radio Live, our new Saturday late afternoon, early evening 1-hour live stream show. This new show precedes our Planetary Healing Club, which starts at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific. The Planetary Healing Club, which is not free and open to the public, but you can join for a minimum donation of just $10 a month. Our new live stream show, which is free, starts Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and 4:30 Pacific. It can be accessed by going to lostartsradio.com/live. You can tune into our live stream from our Facebook page at facebook.com/lostartsradio, from our YouTube channel at youtube.com/lostartsradio, as well as both Periscope and Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. You can ask questions during the show by using the chat function on YouTube or make a comment on Facebook during the live stream. Once again, that's Lost Arts Radio Live, Saturdays at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. As of January 2018, the Saturday live call-in show is now an interactive video platform called the Planetary Healing Club. The cost is just a $10 minimum monthly donation, automatically billed through your PayPal account. Sign up at lostartsradio.com/club. The Planetary Healing Club is every Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. You get your link to participate in the show upon signing up as a member. Those shows are also archived as well for club members. Listen to our new shows with guests every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. All Sunday shows with guests have archives freely available on our website at lostartsradio.com. You can also find them at blogtalkradio.com/lostartsradio, as well as our YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/lostartsradio. Mixcloud at mixcloud.com/lostartsradio. And finally, look us up under the podcast directory on iTunes. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/lostartsradio or on Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. Be sure to join the free Lost Arts Radio Facebook group as well. Just search for Lost Arts Radio Group within Facebook. You can also join our forum on our website if you want to interact with other listeners. We also have links to all of the great independent musicians whose music we feature each week on Lost Arts Radio. When you do your Amazon shopping, please use Amazon's Smile program at smile.amazon.com. And when you choose Lost Arts Research Institute in Sedona, Arizona as your charity, Amazon will donate 0.5% of whatever your order total is to Lost Arts Research Institute to help fund the building of the school and keep our radio show on the air. Please visit lostartsresearchinstitute.org for more information on the school we want to build. Be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter on our site under the Radio Show tab or right from the button on our Facebook page. Contact Richard at richard@lostartsradio.com or myself, Doug Diamond, at doug@lostartsradio.com. Thanks again for listening to Lost Arts Radio, and we'll see you again next week.
Oh, you want me to be perfect one. It's so easy to see why I push you away. With heaven inside my heart and hell in front of me. Oh, I walk the endless miles to where I need to be, and it's all the same. We're holding out for change. that's in distress. Oh, and everyone's so afraid of making mistakes. With heaven above our heads and hell below our feet, oh, I walk for countless miles to a tune that pushes me, and it calls out my name. Oh, it's time for a change. Yeah, it's time for a change. Oh, you say I've done you wrong, still you wrote me this song. Now still you stay away. You haven't called me for days, with heaven inside my heart and hell